And record to the cloud. Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. Good evening. This is the first of a new series in classes or shiurim on the Parsha, on the weekly Torah portion. Various topics that have to do with some way with the cycle of the Torah reading that we do each Shabbat. This week we're going to look at one of the main events of this week's Parsha of Vayera, which is the Akeida. Right, is most likely one of the most controversial events in the Torah. And just to refresh what it is, after God has promised Abraham and Sarah a son in their old age, after which it seems, according to natural cycles, it seems incredibly unlikely, maybe even supernatural, that they could have a child at all. Then, after having said child, God then asks Abraham to sacrifice said child, his beloved son Isaac, as a gift to God and some sort of show of obedience or gratitude. Abraham then gets Isaac to go up a mountain, and Isaac either knows what's going on, maybe doesn't know what's going on, unclear, we'll get into that. And but eventually, after Isaac asks, hey, Dad, where's the animal for the sacrifice? It's pretty clear that Isaac has some sense that something amiss is up. And Abraham is poised with the ma'achelet, with a knife, posed right over his son's body. And then an angel causes him to stop and causes him to see that there is an ayil b'sfach, there is a ram caught in the thicket. And that ram then actually is used as a tumura, as a substitution for Isaac. So the controversy, of course, is how could it be the case that God who cherishes justice and loves human beings, would ask for human sacrifice? That's like the more, let's call that the universal offense, right? It seems unethical. Again, we see later in the Torah that it's explicitly against Torah law to sacrifice human beings, right? Which we know, though, that human sacrifice is a custom that used to be quite prominent in the ancient world. So it seems like this is a break. This is an innovation of God's to stop human beings from doing this. But it seems like this maybe is like the test case for when this type of thing might stop, because it seems reasonable to Abraham, perhaps, that this is something that a deity would ask. And then the more particular offense, right? The controversy, like the ethical controversy, is killing a person. That seems bad. God shouldn't want that. And the more particular offense is that God has seemingly reneged or rescinded God's generous gift, namely, here's this thing that you've staked your whole life on. Here's this promise that I made to you for you to have generations and a nation to follow after you. And now I'm actually asking to take it back. And it seems not only offensive, but even cruel that after something that Abraham has literally waited his whole life for, and Sarah has waited her whole life for, a child between the two of them, that God would then take it back so forcefully. So that's just kind of laying out, before we get into the texts, the problems. Now, I just want to pause for a second and say, anyone else have any other ways in which they are offended by this or find this provocative or interesting or what have you? So just before we get into the sources, thoughts about the Akeida, before we get into it. So brief, thoughts about what's problematic about it, let's say.
For me, I guess I guess the thing that really stands out to me in the whole narrative is that the focus is very much on Abraham, and it doesn't really kind of take that much into account, like what Yitzhak and Sarah are going through in this whole point. I know, the Midrash will kind of go into that, but in the text itself, that's something that I find kind of difficult.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this is a huge event in this family, and yet it's only one member of the family that really gets highlighted.
There's also the problem of, as you said, killing someone, but not only that, it's copying Dafka, the idolaters, who did do child sacrifice. So how could Abraham think that it would be a valid thing to hear you have to sacrifice your son, Yitzhak? It just doesn't make any sense. And I'll tell you later the things that I found, unless you've already found them.
I'm excited to hear your chidushim, your innovations, your novel insights. Okay, so recap: we have the ethical offense of sacrificing people, the religious offense that Lauren's mentioning in terms of, it seems like the religion that's associated with God, with the true God, seems to be pretty similar to idolatry, right? Pretty similar to just the religions that are in the region. There's the particular offense of, in a sense, God's seemingly breaking God's promise to Abraham and Sarah to take back the gift of Isaac. And then Maxine's kind of narratival offense, or also an ethical offense in terms of just focusing on the man, right? Focusing on the adult man who gets the focus of the story, versus Sarah, who literally gave birth to Isaac, or Isaac, who's about to be sacrificed. Those seem like important perspectives to include as well. Now, like you can say, like Torah as at least an example of ancient literature, it's very rare to find examples of interiority, right? Like God, what's happening inside of somebody being represented in the story. It leaves a lot up for interpretation. Although interestingly, actually, you do see God have a bit of interiority before God decides to let Abraham in on what God's plans are for Sodom and Gomorrah. And that actually, spoiler, that's what I wrote my Dvar Torah on this week. So check that out today or later. All right. So, but let's get into the sources. And here I will share screen, or as I've actually learned from Shiurim I've been listening to, ani mishatef et ha-masach. I will share the screen. It's fun to learn new Hebrew phrases.
Josh, the other thing is mentioning Sodom and Gomorrah. It always bothered me that Abraham argued with Hashem to try and save the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he never once goes to Hashem, what, you want me to kill Yitzchak? What about my wife? What about Yitzchak? So there's also something that's incongruent, which is bothersome.
Right. Yes. Yes, very much. Okay. Fantastic. So can everyone see the source sheet? Zoom by?
Yes.
Okay, great. I somehow made everything very loud, but hope it's okay. Okay. Fascinatingly, one of the things that's actually really quite heartbreaking and beautiful about the narrative of the Akeida is that after Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain, they never have a moment together again, at least that we see in the Torah. And the next time Abraham and Isaac share space, at least that is described in the Torah, is when Abraham has died and Isaac and Ishmael come to bury him. So it leaves open a question of like, what did this do to their relationship? So we have the source here, and it says, then Abraham said to his servants, you stay here with the donkey, the boy and I will go up there. We will worship and we will return to you. And skipping ahead a bit, Abraham then returned to his servants and they departed together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba, and yet Isaac is left out. So the question is, where's Isaac? So we have a number of different ideas here. So interestingly, so the question, I think, kind of the provocation here for those who are going to try to respond to this narrative gap is, why is Isaac missing? And is this a sign of some kind of rupture, or is this actually a sign of some kind of healing or continuity? So here, actually, for example, we see in Breshit Rabbah, the Amoraic Midrash on Genesis, it says, and Isaac, where was he, right? The rabbis are very good readers. They're like, no, where's Isaac? Like, God saved Isaac, right? Where is he? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina says, when Isaac's father perceived that a miracle had occurred, he sent him home in the night, lest the evil eye affect him. So the idea here is that Isaac's being missing, right? The reason Abraham went down alone is because Abraham already sent Isaac home. And interestingly, the narrative, I think, maybe is responding to Maxine's, like the point that she raised about the centering, because here actually Abraham is referred to as the father of Isaac. So Isaac now in some way actually has the focus of the Torah's attention, of the Midrash's attention. The reason Abraham sends Isaac home is because it says to save him from the evil eye. Now, the idea here, right, is that in a time of great fortune or luck, that's actually both a time of great excitement and celebration, but also a time of great vulnerability. That exactly when you're at like your highest, your guard is down in some ways, and the Yetzer Hara, right, or the kind of hara, the evil eye, is going to try to grab you. It's going to try to get you. This is why I think there's like one of the kind of superstitious, for lack of a better term, aspects of Judaism is that like you don't assume good things are happening. Like for instance, when you find out that somebody is expecting a child, you say b'sha'a tova, right? It should happen in a good time. You don't say congratulations. Like a baby shower is the most like when people have baby showers, it drives me like up a wall because I'm like, you don't know what's going to happen. And I think Judaism is quite right in being sensitive to that. You don't know. And not only that, but when something amazing happens, all the more reason to treasure that moment and treasure that fortune and not just be cocky about it or just take it for granted. Abraham, I think, is responding to the incredible miracle that just occurred. And Isaac being missing is actually a sign of Abraham's great care in this reading. So Midrash, this is what we can call like a reparative reading of the text, right? That the text is noticing this gap, where's Isaac? And the offering that the Midrash is offering, that Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina is offering, is that Isaac being missing is actually a sign of Abraham's incredible gratitude and also protective, like trying to make up and be protective of Isaac. So that's the positive side, let's say. And then we can look at maybe a more of a darker reading. So this is Midrash Gadol, which is edited much later than Breshit Rabbah, but it's like a cholent book. It's got midrashim from all kinds of, it's hard to kind of pin down where when these texts were redacted or edited. So again, the question, right? Where's Isaac? So here, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat says, although Isaac didn't die, the scripture regards him as if he had died, and his ashes lay piled on the altar. That is why it said, so Abraham returned unto his young men. So I'm gonna like withdraw for a second there and say, what do you think that means?
Maybe it was like a trauma that he never recovered from.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So he's like locked in that moment, and it's not like he doesn't really have like, he doesn't feel alive yet.
Yeah,
or
like
it could be. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it could be that because the intent was true, sort of counts the same.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So Leon's saying that like the impact of this event left a scar in Isaac's psyche, and in Shosh is saying that the intention of Abraham to carry this out, like Isaac saw that, right? Isaac witnessed his father almost kill him. You got to wonder what that's going to do to a person. Let's put a pin in that because that is going to be a focus of a number of texts we're going to see soon. But it's actually quite interesting. There's actually an incredible book I want to encourage people to check out if they're interested in like discourses of trauma and the Bible. There's a great book called Forgetting Lot's Wife. And it's a really sensitive study of trauma. And one of the ways it thinks about trauma is that it is a memory that doesn't exist as a memory, but actually as some kind of experience of an eternal present, right? That you're still in that experience. It doesn't exist as a memory that you have control over. Like, oh, I remember this, and that thing is the past. It's not the present. But rather, trauma is something that can't be recovered as a memory because in some way you're still immediately immersed in it. It's called Forgetting Lot's Wife. So here we have like Isaac in a sense, like not able to maybe like detach himself from this experience. Interestingly, so Adolf Jelinek was in the late 19th century a scholar of Midrash and mysticism who collected an incredible 6-volume series called Beit HaMidrash, which is a collection of legends, right? Like kind of that are the more like weird and wild and woolly stuff. The later medieval midrashim that are kind of often the seeds for Jewish mysticism. And in one of these collections, he has this teaching from Rabbi Isaac ben Asher Halevi who says that where is Yitzchak after the Akeida? He was actually squirreled away. Whoops. He was actually squirreled away to Gan Eden. Like he went to heaven. Why though? And maybe this is quite to Leon and Shosha's point, because he could heal from the wound. Because while in the Torah it says that Abraham had stretched out his hand with the ma'achelet, with the knife, doesn't say how close Abraham got. And in this reading, he nicked Yitzchak's neck, throat, at least somewhat. Like Yitzchak has, it seems, a non-trivial wound. So like literally the word trauma, right, in Greek means wound. So Yitzchak is wounded, scarred by this experience, and has to go to Gan Eden, right, heaven, but like, paradise. But it seems like, in a sense, a safe space to to convalesce from this immensely traumatizing event. Okay, so Yosef ibn Kaspi in the Mishnah Kesef al Torah, another medieval text, says that he heard a midrash from when he was in Valencia that told him that the reason Yitzchak didn't return from the mountain, right, is because he went to paradise, right? He was taken up to paradise as a reward for his suffering. So here we have a trauma, but it seems like it's psychological, right? It's some kind of psychological trauma that like really left an impact on him. And he stayed in Gan Eden until he went to marry Rebecca, which is why we don't see Isaac. I mean, what's great is it's like a very interesting textual reading that we don't see Isaac show up again until his father marries him off. And even in that, right, there's like a detachment. Like it's not like they do it together. Abraham sends Eliezer, his servant, to go do it for Isaac. And then Rivka comes, and then Rivka comes into Isaac's tent, and they unite. But there's never that connection there. So here we have actually that Isaac was in heaven healing from, it seems like, some kind of psychological impact of this experience until he came back down to the field to pray with God and then to re-enter his life in some way. Yeah.
Josh, how do you know the one before is not an emotional wound versus a physical wound when you said he got physically hurt?
Fair enough. It's definitely possible that, I mean, I think if we go to the original language, I don't know if they would use the word wounds to refer to a psychological wound. Like the notion of trauma, like that we use it today to mean a psychological wound is like a modern reinterpretation of the Greek word for wound, right? That's Freud, or like pre-Freud. So I think when it says wound, it means physical wound, but I think we see like the psychological in the Ibn Kaspi, that we have both sides of it. Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a controversial one, but hopefully no one will get mad at me. So in one of the academic takes on the Torah, there's an idea that maybe the original version of the story is that Isaac did die. And it's very interesting, right? This is what's called the E text, which is a bit out of fashion nowadays in the Bible academic world. But the version of this is that there is an ancient version in which Isaac was sacrificed. And then the Torah came around, in a sense, and reinterpreted it such that Isaac didn't die and was saved. And this is part of a reform, that God is making sure that no more human sacrifice is going on anymore. I see this as kind of like the Torah, in a sense, bringing this healing into our religion, that this is like, there was a version in which it could have gone this way, it could have gone in which like proto-Isaac was killed, but then wasn't. But this is why, says this version, why Isaac never again appears in the text until we get to a new story, which is like a new text. So again, that's like an academic theory and you can take it or leave it. But interestingly, I think we see resonances of this, even in the Midrash, even though the Midrash obviously has a different take on it, has a more unified view of the Torah. But it's a very complex unified view of the Torah in which different aspects or parts of the Torah are working with each other. So here we have Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is another Midrashic text from the 8th, 9th century, edited in Babylonia. So here we see Rabbi Yehuda say, when the knife was on Isaac's neck, Isaac's soul burst out and departed. And when God spoke from between the cherubs, don't raise your hand, right? God stopping Abraham from completing the act. Isaac's soul returned to his body. And Isaac rose up, got on his feet, and knew in the future that there would be Tchias HaMesim, right? That there would be the revival, the revival of the dead, revivification of the dead. Right? He opened his mouth and said, Baruch atah Hashem, mechayei hametim. And that's where we have that bracha from, that we say every day in the Amidah. So that sets a template. The reason I wanted to share that is because Isaac becomes a paradigm in a whole series of midrashim. And not just midrashim, but also medieval texts, especially medieval texts, as not just the gracious gift of God sparing Isaac's life, but actually the willingness to sacrifice, and even, perhaps, being sacrificed. And when especially did these texts become prominent and popular in the Jewish imagination? Around the time of the Crusades. Now, why do you think that is? Real question. Why do you think that is?
Well, I guess I kind of have a leg up because of the book I read, but yeah, so basically during the Crusades was that there were a lot of, you know, there were a lot of attempts at like forced conversion and stuff, and that is, I guess, one of the things that is supposed to kind of justify martyrdom. So there were these people who would, choose to kill their children and themselves rather than convert to Christianity.
Right. So the narrative of Masada, right, becomes one of the programmatic narratives of early Zionism, right? The zealots who are trapped on the mountain Masada, and they kill themselves rather than be captured and defeated by the Romans. In the medieval period, though, there was a different martyrdom narrative which justified, and here we'll see this text, and it shows us something I think, again, we talk about the scandal of the Akeida. It's a scandal that reverberates not just about the story, but even about its implications and what it was seen as justifying. So here we have a text edited by Shlomo ben Shimshon called Sefer Gzerot Ashkenaz v'Tzarfat. And what it is it's a what's the word I'm looking for? It is a record. It is a chronicle of the experiences in Germany and France during the Crusades period. Okay, it says, Zion's precious sons, the people of Mainz, were put through the 10 trials like Father Abraham. And what was the last? So in the Midrash, right, Abraham had to go through 10 nisyonot, 10 tests, 10 trials. And the climax, the 10th trial, the worst of it all, was the Akeida, okay? And they too offered up their sons, exactly as Abraham offered up his son Isaac. There were 1,100 victims in one day, every one of them like the Akeida of Isaac, son of Abraham. Well, kind of like it, except that they went through with it. What we have is evidence that parents in the Crusades saw it as preferable to actually put their children to death at their own hands rather than leave them to the lack of mercy of the Crusaders. Now, this is scandalous, right? Because the notion is we don't have an idea of normative Judaism doesn't have this idea of proactive martyrdom. And even if you were to say, fine, you have this idea in halacha, right, in Jewish law, the yehareg v'al ya'avor, there are some things you should die before you were made to do, namely idolatry, sexual assault and sexual sins, and murder, right? Like if someone puts a gun to your head and says, murder that guy, you can't do it because, as it says in the Talmud, is my blood redder than theirs? And yet, here we have evidence that parents in the Crusades saw it as preferable to die and to kill their children rather than leave them to the cruelty of the Crusaders. Now, you have to put yourself in their shoes, because the ravages of the Crusades were not a joke, right? They destroyed the Jewish communities in the Rhineland. absolutely upending and just eviscerating entire groups of people. So I think, my general strategy in terms of looking at texts that offend us or texts that surprise us is first to try to understand, and then we can kind of critique or make judgments or what have you. But I want to go up a little bit, because how could they come from the text that we have of the Akeida, in which Abraham is spared from having to sacrifice his son, although maybe go back to Shosha's point from the beginning of the shiur, that the intention of Abraham was there to go through with it. Right? Abraham was ready to do it and was about to do it, and then at the last second, God stopped him. But here we have another interesting example, right? Because the rabbis are nerds in all kinds of ways, and they love paying attention to dates and to years and to ages. And if you pay attention to the age of all the characters in the Torah, right? Abraham and Sarah have Isaac, if I remember correctly, 90 years old. And Abraham's around 130 something, I think, when he's asked to sacrifice Isaac. That puts Isaac squarely in middle age. Now, the classic examples we have, images of Isaac we have in the Akeida is that he's a child. And I think the truth is, that's how the story works. But the Orthodox, the official rabbinic reading of the story, cannot forget that Isaac was 45 years old, a grown man, when he was taken up the mountain. And that raises the interesting narratival question, namely, it wasn't that he was a child tricked into doing this, right? The child didn't have consciousness to figure this out. He was an adult. So how could Abraham have gotten Isaac up the mountain, given that he was an adult? And here we have a response to that. Davar acher, another explanation. Rabbi Yitzchak said, at the time that Abraham sought to bind Yitzchak, his son, the latter, said to him, Father, I am a young man, or I'm a man, and I am concerned because I'm young, right? So maybe he's not that old, fine, but he's still in his 30s. I'm concerned that when you're about to kill me, I will have the shakes. My body will shake because I'm scared of the knife, and I will trouble you, right? I will bother you. I will get in the way of this and cause the shechita, the slaughtering of me, to be invalid. Pause for a second. This is a sacrifice, and it is a Jewish sacrifice, at least until God says stop. To shecht an animal, you need to do it with a smooth, sharp knife that can be done in one complete motion, in which it does not catch at all on the neck. It is supposed to be instantaneous. It is supposed to cause no suffering to the animal, in as much as that's possible. All right, it's humane. That's the idea of shechita. Isaac is saying, I'm scared. I know what's going to happen to me, and I'm scared. I'm worried that I'm going to shake, which will cause, when you kill me, for the knife to catch in my neck and cause me to be a treifa, right? An animal that's been killed improperly, torn apart. That's what the word treifa means, an animal that's been ripped rather than shechted. And because of that, then I'll be treif. I won't be a kosher sacrifice. So what should you do, Dad? Please tie me up really well to the altar to make sure I don't move. So how does this reframe Yitzchak's involvement with the Akeida? And that's part A of the question. And part B is, what is the offense, in a sense, it is responding to? Again, real questions.
I'm bothered by this because, well, first of all, this is a
Wait, Lauren, wait, I want to hear that, but I want to make sure that we all get the force of this text first.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought that was a question.
Totally good. No, so the question is, how does this reframe Yitzchak's involvement with the Akeida? And the second part of it is, what's Rebbe Yitzchak's maybe motivation behind this?
Is that a question, or you're going on to explain? So it's
I wanted to give people a chance to jump in if they wanted to. I mean, I can give my ideas first, but
go ahead.
Okay, sure.
Well,
Leon.
I mean, it gives, to your first question,
Yeah.
it gives Isaac this kind of new agency that you didn't expect or doesn't seem to be in the text of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you want to call that, I don't know, complicity, or like he enables the act, and maybe the way that, I don't know, conventionally or traditionally it's read as Abraham's a certain kind of faith that he's expressing through doing it. It all of a sudden becomes a story of Isaac's faith. But I think beyond that too, it's like excuse me for the maybe digression, but like I recently there was this Zoom performance of the ballet to The Rite of Spring, like the Stravinsky, and I never knew it. Like I've listened to that piece of music many times before, but I never realized like the conception of it. The idea was like to use this like pagan myth that had to do with like, the tableau is like the beauty of springtime. Everything's budding and growing, but the rite behind it, like the rite in the name, R-I-T-E, rite, is it's like this pagan ritual of sacrifice in like the height of life.
I mean, it caused riots when it was first performed in the early 1900s.
Right.
And I just want to jump in and add anything about the Rite of Spring. Feel free after Leon's done.
Yeah, I can totally do that.
I wonder if there is a connection there, just in the sense that like it feels like at least to the extent, like, now I guess I'm talking about the way that it might work as a myth, but it feels like it has something to do with like that you maybe the original traumatic experience of being a self-conscious entity in the world is to realize that like there's something kind of random and weird about death, like that you can't control it and that could happen anytime, like you were saying, even in your greatest moment of joy or life. And something about that does feel like just like random, like the sacrifice of innocence. But perhaps part of the story there is that like, unless you accept that, there is like a certain wisdom in accepting that possibility, and until you kind of accept that, you aren't fully alive, like that, you know what I mean, like that's the final step of life.
Well, I mean, you're reminding me of like the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., blessed memory, which said, like, in a sense, unless you're willing to die for something, like you're not really living, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Your life on the line. So here, I mean, this is really interesting, like existentialist reading you're giving it, in the sense of like, what the offense that Rabbi Yitzchak, right? So I want to like kind of, one of the points of presenting the source is that it's not just like us modern people who get like offended by these things, but rather like that is always what drives these types of readings, namely invested readings, right? The rabbis are performing an invested reading in the Torah, that it needs to make sense to them. It needs to work for them. And here Rabbi Yitzchak is saying, Isaac wasn't some brainwashed little dolt that was just brought along with his father's like holy mission. Rather, Yitzchak had agency. And not only that, Yitzchak literally he took the steering wheel. He's like, Dad, I'm seeing something you didn't see. I want to make sure this goes well. And this quite beautiful from Leon, is that not only that, but also like this is a model for us all, that a way to take agency in all of our lives is to take control of what it means to actually prepare ourselves and be willing to do something of transcendent value despite or even including death. And so Max, did you want to say something about Rite of Spring? And Lauren, don't worry, you're still on the docket. I'm going to bring you back, okay?
Yeah, no, I think, that's interesting in Rite of Spring because in contrast with this reading of the Akeida, because, the Rite of Spring, it's like, it is dafka, not like the ledu, like it's not the chosen one. It's the person is chosen to be sacrificed and not to do it. And, I think the really moving thing is like her terror and the terror of everyone else around. Whereas, Yitzhak, like having agency going into this, like completely kind of flips that. And I think in a way, like it's a really kind of moving show of like a strange kind of compassion on the part of Yitzchak. Like, I guess there's kind of this idea of Avraham being associated with Chesed, and then Yitzchak with the Kfura. And so
bound, right? Like Simpson.
Yeah. So like that having you know, if like Avraham is so closely associated with Chesed, then like this would just be all the more difficult for him to do. So Yitzchak kind of, you
Like
know, trying to take an active part in it. And yeah, I feel like that's kind of him trying to take some of the burden off of his father. And I think that's really kind of moving.
All right. Very, very interesting. All right, Lauren, did you want to share something? Sorry to take the circuitous route to get back to you.
Yeah. I see it as actually apologetics for Avraham. If one finally takes the idea that Avraham made a mistake and was not supposed to go this far,
right?
And I know that that's a different reading, but I'll explain it to you later, then it's apologetics. But I must say, to consider this like in terms of like the rite of spring and pagan killing, like that's murder, that's just so not Jewish. It's just bothersome. The other thing I want to say about, that midrash is that, it's mamish right in the Torah, that Yitzchak says, oh, what are we going to sacrifice? Where's the sheep? So if he actually knew that he was going to be the sheep, I don't think he would have asked that. I think it's just rabbinical apologetics. That's my take.
Right. An apology, though, in its original sense, an apologia is a defense. And I think that's right in the sense of it's clearly not the pshat, right? Like the pshat is that Yitzchak, yeah, exactly. That's evidence that he didn't know what was going on. But I think what Rabbi Yitzchak's trying to do, I think, is say, and it couldn't work unless Yitzchak was a willing was a willing participant. It doesn't work anyway. We see it won't work. But a way to allay that is that Yitzchak not only is a willing participant, but actually ends up being the primary driver behind it. Now, very interestingly, I just want to give this outside, not inside, but Ephraim of Bon in his Sefer Zakira, another chronicle from the Crusades, says actually the sacrifices that the medieval Jews made during the Crusades were actually greater than Abraham's. He said, because for Abraham, he was stopped, but we weren't. What I found so strange, you can read the text, it's on the screen right now. This is something I find actually immensely powerful and inspiring in especially the keynote literature, right? Not like keynotes, right? The lamentation literature in Tisha B'Av. And there's many texts that are written not just about ancient times, but actually about Piyutim that come out of the Crusades, is that they have a certain kind of theological daring. That it's not just that we're repeating the past and there's no change in history and really it's our ancestors that experienced everything and we're just a shadow of them, but rather they have a certain kind of, they're exercising their agency and saying, where we're going through is understood through the lens of our primordial past. But on the other hand, actually, it helps us find meaning in what we're doing, but we actually have advanced it. We've actually experienced something that even our ancestors haven't. And God, you better pay attention, right? Do not ignore us. We have given it all for you. You let Abraham go almost to the distance, but you actually didn't stop us. How could you? It says yours was the trial, but ours were the execution. Incredibly striking, chilling, but also powerful. So here we have texts moving from, I think, the more existential to the ethical problem, right? How could God ask Abraham to give up the thing that Abraham loved the most? Now here we're going to let ourselves focus on the focus of Abraham. And I think we're actually going to this will be the last kind of classic part of it we'll look at. And then actually the last section I want to get up before we close for the evening, so we'll close at around 8:00, is what I called collateral damage. And that'll actually respond to Maxine's pircha from the beginning, namely, how can we just focus on Abraham? Okay, so Maimonides, heard of him? The great eagle, 12th century doctor, philosopher, he did it all, legalist. He says, so his book, the Moreh Nevuchim, I mean, one of his books, right? The Guide for the Perplexed is an incredible work of systematic philosophy, but it's done specifically through exegesis. That's what's so amazing about Moreh Nevuchim, is that it's actually a perush. It's a perush on the Torah, and it's telling you how to read the Torah. It's philosophizing through writing a commentary. That's just, and it's a program not just about how you should think about God, right? Philosophy and theology, but it's also a program in terms of hermeneutics, how you should read the text. So many of the things that Abraham is dealing with are philosophical problems he's finding in the Torah. So he's going to say, fine, here's the Akeida. Here's a philosophical problem I have with it. He says, as for the story of Abraham at the Akeida, it contains big ideas that are fundamental principles of the law. Okay, so he sees this as dictating something that is programmatic. And what is that? It says, one of these notions consists in our being informed of the limit of love for God and fear of God. That is, up to what limit they must reach. So what is the Akeida teaching us? The Akeida is teaching us how much it means to love or to fear God. Namely, what does it mean to love or to fear anything, right? It means to relate to them in a way that is primary, in which they are number one priority and everything else exists in its shadow, right? It's the way in which a mother supercharged with adrenaline can lift up a car to save her baby, right? That primal love in which everything else falls by the wayside. And Moshe ben Maimon, right? Maimonides is saying, what if we actually take that idea all the way? Now, in the Gemara, right, in the Talmud, it says, how do we understand fear of God? And one of the rabbis say, I forget which one, apologize, says, it's imagine it like you're scared of a human. And like your first reaction to that is like, that's offensive. Melech basar v'dam, melech malachei malachim, right? A king of flesh and blood is not like the king of kings, right? That's the king of kings. We're talking about God. How can we say it's like a human being? Except, let's all close our eyes for a second. Remember the last time you were driving in a car and you heard a police siren and you see the flash of red and blue lights. Can you feel the jolt of terror in your heart that you're scared they're coming for you? Or, I mean, this is like not a funny analog, but like, this is the empathy, the need to understand that empathy of like the fear of police that is instilled in so many Black young men, especially, right? In terms of relating to something as a primordial source of fear because they hold a certain kind of violent power over your life. For us, so many of us, God is theoretical. And Rambam is saying, what if it weren't? What if the Akeida is teaching us what it really means to love and fear God? Namely, that thing that you love the most, you need to give it up. Or he keeps on going. He says, for in this story, Abraham was ordered to do something that bears no comparison, either with sacrifice of property or even with sacrifice of life. Sacrificing Isaac is bigger than even losing his own life. It's bigger. Now, again, you can push back and say, yeah, but like, that's centering Abraham, and it's worse for Isaac. It's him losing his life. He's not just a tool for Abraham's self-actualization. That's true. But just think of the experience Abraham is having. And that's the power that Rambam is trying to draw from this. Not just power in terms of it being meaningful, but programmatic. That Abraham has to literally sacrifice, is being asked to sacrifice the thing that the person, right, the the being in his life that means the most. And that is what it means to love God. It's radicalizing. In truth, it is the most extraordinary thing that could happen in the world, right? It's wondrous in a way that terrifies us, right? Such a thing that one would not imagine that human nature was capable of it. The fact that Abraham was able to supersede his attachment and his protection, and in a way, I think Aram is saying his selfishness, to return to God what God gave him, is an incredible amount of, is the extent of the love that Rambam sees as being the goal. Thoughts?
I was gonna say like that last part almost strikes me as almost abusive in a way,
Mm-hmm.
because like we were made with certain attachments and like human basically, right? And so to come and be like, oh, like I'm just gonna play and like twist your mind in a way and test you, it in my mind it almost borderlines abuse. Like if this were a person doing this to another person, that's like playing psychological games. That's literally the definition of abuse.
I think we have to be careful when we draw abuse into the calculation, which I think like right now I think people are very emboldened to, I think, use that framework. Right, like instead of just calling something lying, everything is gaslighting. Like sometimes you're just lying. I mean, I don't want to overwrite that. I think Shosh, what you're raising is quite provocative, and I think you're putting your finger on something that's really powerful. Namely, it is an incredibly violent thing that God is asking of Abraham. Not just like literally violent, but it's like but I think in a sense that is Rambam's point. Like it is literally the most value. Like it is like nothing else matters, or nothing else matters to Abraham. And I think the question he's asking is, what would it be like actually to live a life in which you'd be able to sacrifice the thing that matters most to you? That's what the Akeida is teaching us. So I think actually, and we're going back to the point that Leon made before about like having agency over death or over loss. And I think like one thing I think Maimonides is maybe implying too is that like it is the case that we don't keep anything. So why are we holding on so strong? Now, this isn't to say you should go off and like murder a pet or something, but like the point is that rather like how does this transvalue our lives? How does actually like really taking seriously the radicalizing force of God change what it means to exist in a world? I think this is lahavdil, Aleph Havdalas. It is why, I mean, like understanding this helps us understand suicide bombers, right? In the sense of like, when that's the thing that matters the most, you're willing to do things that are offensive to modern ethical sensibilities, that you're willing to do something that is atrocious, murderous, rampage, like a crime, because human law falls away. So that's like a really awful side of this. But again, like I think it's important to try to understand as much as we can about the world. I mean, a more virtuous element of this is the martyrdom or the willingness to put your life on the line that we mentioned before in terms of like fights for justice and fights for civil rights and things like that, in which you're putting your body on the line. You're putting yourself on the line. I think it's supposed to just, I mean, I think in some ways Rambam is looking at the offense or the scandal of the Akeida and saying, yeah, let's turn it up more. Like the scandal is the point, right? The offense that you feel at that ask is the point. It is offensive. It is, as I think Shosh is implying, or not implying, explicitly saying, like, it borders on, let's say, an abusive emotional dynamic. But maybe there's truth in that as well. Not in the sense of like you should go around manipulating people, but rather there's truth in the sense of what does it mean to really contemplate the radical extent of what this means, how it changes your whole life in an instant. Something to, I think, like leave us disturbed by. I'm going to skip Kierkegaard because that's tired. It's been done to death. There is a version of this in which the rabbis try to walk it back, and maybe this is the one that's like, I went like, let's put our like finger in the wound, let's like push it really hard, let's salt it. But here the rabbis are saying, okay, maybe let's not go all the way. Yitzhak Arama says, if a person should not say that if God told me to kill my son, I would. So Yitzhak Arama is saying, oh, chill out, Rambam, maybe actually this isn't as programmatic as you want it to be. Here we actually have in Bereshit Rabbah, we have actually God say, listen, I said take your son. I didn't say kill him. Like, what were you doing? I didn't ask for that. For the sake of love did I say it to you. I said to you, bring him up, and you have fulfilled my words. Now bring him down. So in this reading of Bereishit Rabbah, actually, it says the Akeida, in a sense, never would have happened anyway, because actually what God asked was just the kavana, in a sense. God was ambiguous, but all God asked for was to bring up Isaac. Sacrificing Isaac was actually never in the plan. So I think in that way, actually, like, I think that might be like an ancient reverberation or resonance with some of the, maybe like, again, the moral or ethical offense that I think a number of us have mentioned tonight about that ask being made. All right, so here we're wrapping up, but I do want to say that the rabbis don't forget that this was a real thing that happened, and to real people in the Torah. One example, and we'll just say that's on the outside, is that Isaac, one version of the Midrash is actually that Isaac was blinded by this. And that's or Isaac's eyes were weakened. We see later that the reason Jacob's able to deceive Isaac is because Isaac's eyes were weakened. How did they get weakened? Through tears. Actually, Abraham was crying as he was about to perform this act, and those tears leaked into Isaac's eyes and ended up actually damaging him. And I think that's a really beautiful and painful image of the scar that's left on Isaac's, in Isaac's body and Isaac's soul by this, there's the shared suffering in this, but also that you don't leave it behind. There was a real mark and a wound that was left. And last but not least, we have Sarah Imenu. We have Sarah, our mother. And again, responding to the centering of Isaac. But here the rabbis actually say, wait, people were forgotten. It is not an accident, said the rabbis, that the reason that Chaye Sarah, the portion which records the death of Sarah Imenu, happens right after the Akeida. And why is that? Because, say the rabbis, Sarah was so shocked and so distraught by this experience that she died. That the collateral damage of this was actually his mother's life. A tragedy. The rabbis reread this as a tragedy of sorts. It says, when Abraham came to slaughter Isaac, Isaac said to him, Father, right here, repeating this tradition, like, tie me down, etc., etc. And says, Father, don't tell Mom, because they're about to come. But actually what ended up happening is that Satan ended up tricking Sarah and having her come, and having her believe that Isaac was killed. And because of that wound that was left. I want to actually, in a sense, leave it on that the rabbis, I think, are not just going to paper this over and say, you know what, everything was fine. The Akeida wasn't a big deal. Abraham was faithful. It was a test of his faith. Good job, Abraham. But they say, no, real damage was done. Real damage was done to Isaac. Real damage was done to Abraham. Real damage was done to Sarah. And it's important that we don't forget that. And I think actually that might be, in a sense, a meta lesson that we are drawing from the Meforshim, the Perushim, the interpretations of the Akeida, that real lived religious and spiritual life has consequences. And the choices we make have impact. And that's something to remember. And we might be asked to do something really important. We need to remember always that it's being done with real people. I need to go. But I thank you all for joining me. And I'll see you, God willing, soon, Tuesday night for the Kabbalah class. So keep your eyes peeled. All right, take care, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night, everyone.